Megan, I thought I'd start with you. I was just wondering, being on the front line, working with people experiencing homelessness, what do you think of the CIB model after watching the film?
Well, I think the first time watching the film, for anyone in the social services, doing frontline work, working in an organization, the drive to fund our programs, to prove that they're working, even without a CIB model, it's always there. We do extensive research. We are academics in our field, and we see research studies and we see years of development of programs that work. And so watching this, I'll use social worker lingo for a minute, I had this feeling of this doesn't work for me. There's something about this that doesn't sit right for me. And what it comes down to for me in my frontline work is really understanding the root causes of poverty, of homelessness, of problematic drug use, is rooted in capitalism. It's rooted in capitalism and the patriarchy and colonialism. And to me, seeing this model and knowing how these issues interact on the day-to-day lives of my clients, to me, it almost seems like capitalism has reached its top point. You know, the idea of investors being able to make a return on folks who capitalism and colonialism have not treated well has always been the losers in this game. On an ethical standpoint, as a social worker, as someone who is accountable to my clients, it doesn't hold true for me. There was a moment in the movie where he was driving towards the end and he said, you know, John is going to be on this program for probably another year. It's my job to get him to stay home, to cut down on the drinking, to do all of these things. From the model that they're using, which is the Housing First model, which is incredibly well researched across many different countries, the job isn't to get someone to step down off a program or, you know, go through something in a really chronological way. The goal of success, and we know in social work research, is that best case scenarios and excellence in research makes the client the center of any sort of programming, and not just the client, but the community that they're in. As was really shown in the film, in the CIB model, there isn't a place at the table for the client, let alone the community. So that was one thing that I picked up on. The other thing was when the gentleman who's now running for governor, when he said that this is for folks who have a problem with how the government chooses to spend their money, that, you know, maybe the social services, maybe they're not rigorous, they're just handing out money to kind-hearted social workers who just give it away in bus tickets. I have never met a group of more rigorous researchers than those who are doing research methods like participatory action research, those who are really on the front lines of social service research and delivery. We're already under a microscope from any sort of funding that we're getting now, and those processes are incredibly rigorous. So I do sort of question that idea that services can be more well-researched and are indeed in the public's better interest because private social impact bonds are giving them money and making their own decisions on where money should go. The other thing as a frontline worker, there was a moment in the film where John and Math were on the street and the other gentleman who had a stroke had come up and say, you know, will you help me? Please help me. I'm going to trust you. Will you help me? In a situation where folks are going through this model of a social impact bond, I'm the person that has to be accountable then to that individual or that community, not the investors. So I think at the end of the day, the power imbalance is just so great without a really rigorous ethical piece attached to it that in my work, from my perspective, it doesn't make sense for me.
Rob, you did work with Mainstay and trying to set those targets or get a sense of how they would evaluate the success of the program. In your view, what would a mature market of social impact bonds look like?
Yeah, it's somewhat hard to say because the you've got the guy who started it all, Sir whatever
Ronald
his name,
Cohen.
yeah, Sir Ronald. He is out there promoting it, and it seems like it's all a buzz in government, and as a result, you're probably going to see a lot more of them. At the start of the movie, he says that there are 40 of them. We started our research into SIBs about a year after that, and there were 75 of them worldwide, and they're growing right now. I have no idea what they are, but I'm sure it's a lot. I'm sure it's probably doubled.
It's 120, I think.
120.
Now.
Okay. So governments everywhere are looking for ways of funding things without spending money. The catchword is you want to do more with less. So you're going to see a lot more of these. I suspect, though, that you'll probably find over the long run that if the purpose of these is to cut down on the risk of government investing in a social program that doesn't have a good output, it doesn't have a failed social program, if you will, then these SIBs will have a short lifespan, because what will happen is if you test it and it works, you mentioned the Housing First model. It's been tested. They know it works. So there's no risk in investing in that. So I don't, in that particular case, I really don't see the benefit of having an evaluation done. It's been evaluated. There's no point in paying investors in that particular case. If it's a new program and you want to test it, test it. If it doesn't work, then okay, the investors paid for it. They lose some money. As the guy from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives said, in all likelihood, the public will still probably fund some of the money. But then okay, it fails, so don't invest in that. But if it succeeds, then you've tested it, then you don't need to retest it. Right? So at that point, why are you issuing the SIB? Why aren't you just simply funding it? So I see a sort of short lifespan. If the motivation is to take the risk off the taxpayer, then it should have a short life. If it's to save the government money, well, the jury's out on that as well, because when you really stop and think about it, government is comprised of a bunch of different silos. And they mentioned that they were shocked to find that it actually was a cost to government to have the SIB. Well, the cost to government is governing, right? If government wants to get out of governing, it can save a lot of money. But if government is governing, then what happens is, as soon as you get these people stably housed, the very first thing you do is you get them on social assistance. You get them connected, you get them their ID, you get them an address. All of these things happen, and then they become full citizens again, entitled to all of their benefits. And so the social services department's budget goes through the roof. Whose budget goes down is correctional services, health, because you don't have people showing up at emergency with overdoses, or psychiatric issues because they couldn't afford their meds. So there's a bunch of winners and there's a bunch of losers. It's really, really tough to collect data in any social program, to collect data that shows that the government is making money in such a complex field, or it's saving money in such a complex field, is a real challenge. And I sort of, you have to live with a level of muddiness in the data that shouldn't give anybody a lot of confidence. I mean, my job is supposed to be collect the best information that time, budget, and circumstances allow, and be as objective as possible. So when we looked at Mainstay, it looked like a very reasonable. Deloitte had already gone over the numbers, so that they had a business case in place. And they talked about a figure of 75%. Well, we had to lower that number substantially, way down, because they were assuming that that was based upon the people who had graduated from the program. The investors thought it was based upon the people who enter the program. So in that 3-year period, if people dropped out or left, just hightailed it out of there, they didn't like living in the home, they didn't count in Mainstay's view. They didn't get the full 3 years of treatment. From the investor's point of view and the government's point of view, Anybody who went into that program should have been part of that outcome. So when they said 75%, 75% of the people going into the program should be stably housed at the end of it. Mainstay was not thinking in those terms. They were thinking of the people who stepped down after the third year. 75% of them would be in the program, would count as a success. So the numbers were radically off. And they still haven't come to terms. They're still working on, and now I don't know how many years it's been, 3 years now?
Almost 4.
Almost 4, and Sir Ronald says it should be done in 3 months. So it's been 4 years for them. Another one in Ontario looks like it's going ahead. They have the same issues. It's one for children and runaway children and children at risk of homelessness or their abusive life at home. And the program is intended to get them stably housed and also get them back in school and have them progress to the next grade or graduate. Again, those measures are very, very difficult to assess. And then you have the real tough issue is the sharing of data from ministry to ministry to determine, is it a win-win? It's really hard to say. It's not going to be clear.
Mm-hmm. Let me get Cathy in, because Cathy, you've been doing a lot of your own research, yes, with trying to measure impact that your programs are having without a SIB involved, just for, yes, your own benefit to try and, yeah, improve outcomes for your clients. So what's that experience been like for you?
Well, first, if I may, I would just like to say thank you for such a beautiful film.
Oh, thank you.
Wow, well done. Mm-hmm. So at our organization for DASC and looking at what is the social impact, we're a small nonprofit agency and a social enterprise, and you're challenged very much about capacity, right? So sometimes like we're in the trenches, we're doing the work every day, so to rise above it, one of the things that I think happens in small nonprofits and social enterprises is that you're so involved daily that you forget to take your head up and to say, what is the ripple effect? So yes, people have, service. They have a reason to wake up in the morning. They have social engagement. They're increasing their economic engagement, their social inclusion, all of that kind of stuff. But we haven't really looked at what's the ripple of that. So what's the full social impact of being able to participate in the programs that DASC can provide for people? So does it mean that because somebody is there, then they're actually able to live at home longer, so they're not living in care? That there is less hospital admissions, maybe because there's quality people in their lives, that kind of stuff. It could be that a one-income family, because somebody had to stay at home, all of a sudden, because somebody now has service, they become a two-income family. So we have to start thinking about how we tell that story about what our impact is. And the reason I started it just on a very elementary level, thinking about social impact bonds, is that we have too many people without service in our community. There are too many people that are waiting, and it's very, very difficult to sit in somebody's front room or around the kitchen table and say you have to wait. And proposal after proposal after proposal to government, the basket just isn't big enough in government. And so for all the reasons that we know it's not big enough and we want to change it, so there's got to be another way. Right? So we look at social enterprise, we look at government, we look at foundations, and so why not look and say, well, what is this world of social impact bonds, and should we just dismiss it, or should we learn as much as we can about it before we make a decision? And that's the place that I reside in right now. And having watched the film a couple of times, there are moments where like the end justifies the means. So where the money comes from and what the consequences are, if it means more people in more service, the human side of that film just brought me back into people's homes that are waiting for service, right? And in front of my clients who really need some support. So I think that it can't be easily dismissed. I think that we need to, there's some things that, in the SIBs that were mentioned, my brain goes to, so how come they get a return in the school system all the way through to grade 12? I'm sure that beyond that program, there are teachers and there are services and there are things that in those children's lives that have made them successful. And so should the investors get all of the benefit of all of that? So I do believe that we need to look at the ones that are successful. We need to really look at, if there is one, how do you bring the community into that very beginning stage to say, part of the metrics, what are you going to measure? How are you going to find out what it is that you're going to say means success? And how are you going to quantify the things that are qualitative? So what is quality of life? What is happiness? What is those kinds of things? And how are you going to measure them? And what value would you put on them? And so how could you bring that whole conversation into the social impact bond in a different way? So I think that we could learn from the experiences that are there now and say, if the true intention of social impact bonds is to test something, to be innovative, and then once you've proven the point, then government comes in as a partner. They've been a partner from the very beginning, and then they come in and then they take it over. The sad part is a lot of the stuff that we're doing is tried, trusted, and true, and it's good. Do you have to be innovative? Do we need to package it in a different way to make it attractive? And on the other side, yes, there's lots of things that we can do to be innovative and creative if we have the capacity to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Now, the part that's always tripped me up about social impact bonds is that they're more, it's a financing model. Mm-hmm. It's not a funding model. Yep. So the government has to repay the money if it's successful. So yep. That still doesn't solve the funding problem. So, but Danny, let me bring you in. You were very vocal in your opposition to social impact bonds when the Nova Scotia government was talking about them or considering them. Do you want to talk a little bit about
that? Sure, and thanks. And I just want to say thanks too to the people that are on the front lines every day trying to deal with many of the problems that we're facing as a society. They work in very trying circumstances with not much money, and they got way too many files on their desk oftentimes, to try to handle the workload that we have. But I think part of the reason that we oppose it, if social impact bonds are meant to just kind of privatize some of the public services that we have now, then that's one of the reasons we'd oppose it. We oppose it because of the funding mechanism. Like, these are very complicated when it comes to the funding mechanism, and oftentimes what happens is those people that have the wealth to get, the rates of returns that we're talking about on the film, 13%, 8% kind of stuff, are pretty huge rates of return to get on a project. We as taxpayers, at the end of the day, in most cases, are on the hook. It gets complicated when the funders, they say they're going to put in however much money they're putting in. They pull a group of people together to kind of manage it. They work out the contracts. They work out the deals. It's not often. Sometimes I think the government's even at the table when some of those things get worked out. They come, offer a proposal to them and say, here's what it's going to be, here's what the outcomes are, and off they go to try to do things. But I don't think as a whole it really achieves a lot of the outcomes that we suspect. I don't think there's much innovation to it. I think you're not going to see very much innovation to it. You're going to see the ones that they do that worked in other places. People are going to want to kind of hitch their wagon to the things that already worked without being innovative. And I'm concerned about, the funding mechanism as well for the groups that we have around the province that work and try to help people, when people that ultimately make donations and kind of can help support that group through those donations are going to look at this now as being I'm not going to donate to whatever organization. I'm going to, and I'm the chair of Literacy Nova Scotia, and literacy organizations across the country have been, folding up their doors for the last number of years because of funding kind of things, right? And then you see some of these things come along, you have to question about, nobody's given actual donations to those organizations that are trying to work on the ground and help people, because now they have an opportunity to make some money on a program that may or may not work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have to say that some of the foundations that have been investing in this space really are interested in testing innovative programs. There's some examples in the United States, not the one profiled in the film, but another one that came on later in South Carolina, that all of the investors are looking at putting all of their returns back into the program and have a policy after the program ends to advocate for the government to take on the program and roll it out across the state. So I think this has been tried in many different countries. Each one is different, and I just wanted to share that. But if there's questions from the audience, you know, we're...
If they reinvested back,
Yes.
is it then a true SIB?
Well, this is the, I mean, I think
it's beautiful, it's a great thing.
I think the definition of a social impact bond is changing.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think it's what Sir Ronald Cohen had in mind
Right.
When he created it, but I think foundations, I mean, if you, their assets that they have, there's only a small percentage of it that they can donate, give away as donations, yes. And there's a very large amount that they're investing, and rather than invest it in companies that don't necessarily fit their mission, they'd rather invest it in a social program. So they're looking for ways that they can invest that money that's in line with their mission, and then take that return on investment that they get from government and plow it back into the program. So there are, I think there are examples of SIBs where they're really trying to stay true to the purpose, which was supposed to be innovate, and then increase service, better services on a larger scale. Sorry, Rob?
I'd like to add to what Cathy had said before about the qualitative aspect of it, because it really is a difficult thing in social research to define quality of life for someone who's addicted, for someone who's homeless, for a single mother. It's very, and quality of life means different things to them. But to the investor, the quality of life issue is a real problem, because it's a subjective measure. Whatever measure you come up with, it's going to be a subjective measure. And they don't like that. In fact, more than the investor, because the investor is going to trust that if there is a quality issue, we would get it by asking Megan what her experience was. Do you think that, you know, the frontline workers who have experience with these people, has their life gotten better? Do you think that they're in a better place? That's how researchers would obtain the quality of life information anecdotally. Government would be the one that would have a problem with it, because government would see it as being an easy win for the investor, and wouldn't want that as a trigger mechanism. So getting the quality of life thing, I think, is one of the most important aspects. And you saw, what is it, Matt, who was the counselor there?
Math, yeah.
And he's able to see what the quality, he could see the improvement. Yeah. So as a researcher, as an evaluator, I would ask to speak to Matt, but that wouldn't be in the contract. The contract would be how many, how long, what's the duration of the impact, those sorts of things.
Very black and white.
It's very black and white, because they're looking for clear and objective triggers. And quality of life is not a clear, objective thing. It is to Matt. It is to you. You can see progress. But demonstrating that it's an objective measure, it's really hard to get.
If I can just add, back a number of years ago, we had somebody come in from Toronto and did a study on early learning and public childcare as an example, right? And we tried to sell some of those kinds of programs to the province at the time, which of course they didn't buy into. But one of the things that is really difficult is that if, and the study said, if the government entered into that program and did that as a public service, it would add two percentage points to the GDP in Nova Scotia. Now, if I was, you know, a wealthy blueberry magnate who came up with an idea and said, let's do away with some of the public sector, which made front page news, you know, in the provincial paper, as opposed to somebody that's a labor leader that says, wait a minute now, I can tell you how to raise our GDP by 2 percentage points. And like, people would go nuts if somebody wealthy said, I have an idea to raise the GDP in this province by 2 percentage points, right? That's just kind of, you know, I think that's an important point, given that some of the SIB programs are running around the education aspect, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's just, you know, those people want to see numbers at the end of the day. So if you put people through to get their GED as an example, they'll get paid for however many people get their GDP. What happens to them after that? Doesn't make any difference. But that's, you know, that's that's kind of how my sense of it, and I'm not an expert in any of it, and I've read lots of stuff about it, but it's, you know, and it's complicated as well.
One interesting thing in the film is that nobody talked about raising taxes.
Well, no, Larry Brown did.
Did he?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
Yeah.
But I think, like, to put it in a Nova Scotia context, so part of my work is working with community groups and doing advocacy specifically around social assistance. So we currently have, not just here in Nova Scotia, in many places across this country and others, this sort of austerity narrative that we don't have money, there's not enough to go around. Our community services had a very big surplus this year. Our housing shelter rates haven't risen in over 25 years. And David McDonald from the CCPA wrote a great piece about talking about it's not about not having enough, it's where we as a society want our money to go. And I think that's similar to what Danny is saying. We have this idea within this austerity model that those with capital are doing something right, that they have something to teach the rest of us about how to be successful. And that's sort of neoliberalism at its finest. So when we're advocating for, say, a raise in income assistance, well, fair taxation, and there's rigorous research that tells us this, fair taxation would do that. Fair taxation would, in fact, make sure that we're not closing schools for, kids not performing well. I think that looking at this as there's not enough money to go along, that's a purposeful narrative that we've been given.
Mm-hmm. I think did I see a question? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm really glad to hear the discussion around qualitative versus quantitative measurements and how that comes into being. But the reality is that nonprofits are already there. We are already facing this struggle. If you work in social services organizations, you are already dealing with this, most likely from your corporate funders, around here's the template, fill in the boxes. We don't want to hear a story. We want to hear a number. And so charities are already there in this quandary of how do we measure our outcomes, how do we demonstrate impact. Something that doesn't seem to have been talked about at all, though, is around the capacity to do that measurement. Nonprofits, where do they get the databases? How do they afford them to then be able to do the measurement? How are they paying their staff the time to take off the floor if you work in a shelter, to sit at your desk and input the data that's needed to go in? Who's paying for that portion of your shift? To have that overlap, to be able to do that. These are real issues that charities are facing, and yet no one's talking about that infrastructure to be able to do that type of measurement. And I think that's a huge piece that's missing. And when we're putting together business plans for investors around, this is the value of my program, that piece is, everybody likes the shiny new program, the shiny new project with a short lifespan that's going to move the needle. But there's real issues there that have to be addressed first before you can demonstrate any of that. And I find it interesting that no one really talked about that infrastructure and capacity building that has to be in place first. So.
Well, the people who are promoters of SIBs, they actually, that's one of the things that they'll say SIBs are great for, because there is a mandatory evaluation that has to be done by a third party, and they have to build capacity within the nonprofit organizations in order to fulfill those evaluations. And one of the reasons Mainstay was selected as a finalist in the RFP in Ontario is because it had already been working with an evaluation company in Toronto, studying in much the same way Cathy is studying its work for the past 3 years. But you're absolutely right, evaluations are very expensive, especially if you're doing randomized control trials. But those are included in the cost of the SIB.
There are a lot of, in Ontario, the Ontario Trillium Foundation that funds a lot of social programs, mandates that I think 10% of their grant money must go to evaluation. But interestingly, like when you brought that up, the issue of capacity, when you consider the market for SIBs, if you will, all the different service organizations competing to try to get investors. Mainstays, you said 4 years. It takes effort over that 4 years. They're not getting any money for that. They have staff that could be working on other things, that are working on business plans for the SIB. So there's a component to it that I think will filter out the people that don't have that sort of administrative background, and smaller little organizations will have a much rougher time getting heard. Just the fact that, Mainstay was considered one of 4 finalists, it makes it sound like a contest right off the bat, right? And I think there was 50 or so in the
89.
89
Yeah.
competing, and now you're down to 4, and they're 4 years into it, and they haven't got it yet.
I think organizational capacity and how organizations, how we build capacity when sometimes you think that there isn't any left. I think that's one of the huge challenges that our sector, I guess, faces, and is looking at all of your resources that are available to you and beyond your staff and your board and the people that you support in your community, and how you build that capacity together. That's one of the, I think for me, and the many years that I've been doing this work, that's the one thing that I find the most challenging, is finding capacity in places where you think it just doesn't exist anymore, and you find it, right? Organizations that are good and solid, it's amazing what can come out of those kinds of organizations. But I think it's about building a good foundation and a good structure and that good value base. And those are the things that really help build the capacity within it. Yeah.
I think though too, just to speak to that point, like with an example here in Nova Scotia, the organizations that we work for, been around for a while, have seen sort of changing things, and we have a history with the community that often serves us well. However, I really think in the work that I've been doing, where I see true innovation is community members just saying, enough with the organizations, we're just going to solve this, we're just going to do this. So, for example, 902 Man Up. It's a group that's working in Uniacke Square, working around issues of violence. That group, they're all volunteers. Because of the community they come from, because of them all working other jobs, they would never be able to access something like a SIB. So I do think that we have to look at our organizations as organizations that do have power, that we are also, because I work for the North End Community Health Center, you work for this, that's also a form of privilege and power, and whose voice gets heard when we talk about innovation. And I think that is something we also have to examine, is that true innovation not necessarily coming from organizations, but coming from community.
And sometimes organization is community, they are synonymous.
Sometimes.
Yes.
So was there another, is this lady in the front? Oh, Arlene.
So, I came in because, of course, we're one of those not-for-profits that's constantly looking to resource capacity to do the work that we're doing, and so social impact bonds, it's like, okay, what's the potential in this? But when I saw his eyes light up at the thought of going from an 8% return to a 13% return, I thought, this is just that 1% growing in a different way.
Yeah.
And when I hear like the Heart Stroke Foundation, that one of the triggers for payment is number of bums in the seats, there's no impact to that.
If I could address that, though, I think the idea of enrollment, it may be spurred on by the evaluators. The reason being is that in order to make a determination that a trigger should be pulled, you need sufficient evidence. And if you don't, if they expect 40,000 people to be in, and they don't get 40,000 people, the evaluator is stuck with an inconclusive result. And although I can't imagine that would be the case with 40,000 people, but in smaller SIBs, like the ones that I'm involved with, where you're talking about 300 people, if they don't get the 300 and they only get 100, you can't, there won't be any payout. And so if you give an incentive for there to be an early payout, then all of a sudden the investors are willing to have more money go to the supports necessary, the administration necessary to recruit more participants.
And see, that still goes back to how the dollar flows and not the impact.
It's not client-centered. It's not client-centered at all.
It's not client-centered. You know, I've run work transition programs for women and really resisted against government saying the only outcome of that was with women that went into post-secondary education, and the number of women, so we had 12 participants and only 3 went in. But you know, when you have stories of women whose whole family life trajectory has changed because now they all get up in the morning and they all go to school, and the kids then move to graduation, that's not measured. I could say, oh yes, that woman was in that program and completed you know, a program and have had no impact. She completed it, left, went back to her life, nothing changed. But I can tick a box and say, yes, that's one of that 700.
To me, it's very equivalent to the you know, to evaluating a piece of art by saying how much paint was used and how many brush strokes.
Exactly, it's exactly that way. So I think the risk, but I think what the potential, the opportunity is that now people that are holding wealth are thinking socially. So to get their mindset to shift from how can I make money off this to how can I use the money I have to have some impact in community, more like what you said around donors, and if you've got the risk, if you can afford to lose $17 million, then maybe you can afford to put that into your community. Yeah.
I think the other point that you raise around, I really think as a society we need to start thinking differently and more critical about things. Government, you know, has an obligation to fund certain things. That, you know, we have there's poverty issues, both adult and child poverty in this province are very high. Government makes choices every day, so we need to challenge more about some of the choices they make. But you know, somebody raised about the taxation system, right? I mean, there's all those kinds of questions that we need to start thinking more critical about, and you know, making our governments more accountable for some of the choices that they're making. And as a society, what is it that we want to see? Do we want to work to eliminate poverty, you know, and do those kinds of things that everybody's working hard to do, but every year, you know, funding gets cut, this gets cut, it's going somewhere else kind of stuff, right? And then, you know, what really kind of irks me a bit to see that stuff around going from 8% to 13%. And, you know, in my view, I guess, kind of people are really, you know, those wealthy people are looking at this as a way now I'm not going to donate because I could do an SIB possibly and get a fairly good rate of return on my money. And some of it will work, but my other concern too is, and I can't say this strongly enough, is that oftentimes we as taxpayers, the government ends up paying much more for these things than you know. And I think that's part of it that needs to be delved into a little bit more here, because sometimes, you know, if government enters into a contract with somebody to provide a service, we need to make sure that the cost of whatever things that they do to help that kind of be the success needs to be accounted to and counted in as the cost of that SIB as well, kind of stuff.
I think we have time for one more question.
So my question follows along my colleagues Arlene's. What struck me most was the returns that these folks are getting. So I'm wondering about the range of returns that you've seen in this sector, and what's the how often do you see people who are in there just at kind of the break-even idea with their investment? Because this 13%, it is far beyond what most people would expect as a reasonable business return. Mm-hmm. Are there people who are happy with just a return that addresses the rate of inflation, for example? Mm-hmm. That's true social impact investing, in my view.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you that globally it's ranging between 8 and 12%. The lowest return I've ever seen is in a Regina program, which was 1.3%, which was an American potash company. And they actually are waiting 7 years for a return. But then I think maybe you have to ask the question of what kind of access, persuasion, influence does that get them with the Saskatchewan government? But as I mentioned, there are some philanthropies that are, you know, looking at a 0% because they're going to put all of their money, the ROI back into the programs.
It's just interesting that if they go through that whole quite expensive and long and intensive, human resource intensive process of an SIB, only in the end to take the money that they earned and invest it. Why go through that whole first process? Now, why not invest that money or donate that money into those programs? And like the panelists have said, there's so much research already into the programs that we know do well.
I think they think when there's money on the table that it validates the program in a way that academic research doesn't. And then they can get the political and public will to support the expansion of a program like that because they can show the financial value. I think we have to go. I'm getting all sorts of signals from the back. I want to thank our panel. Really great to have you here.